Behind every solemn boom of artillery salute lies an amazing story full of unexpected twists and human ambitions. Who actually came up with this majestic tradition? From Peter the Great's fireworks to Stalin's decision in August 1943, a 300-year journey will lead us to a truth that may surprise you. Are you ready to learn how the symbols of our victory were born? Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new historical investigations. Now, tell us in the comments, do you think artillery salutes really helped to raise the morale of the people? Or was it just a beautiful ceremony? Share your opinion. The sounds of celebration have accompanied humanity since time immemorial. When warriors returned from the battlefields, cities greeted them not with silence, but with loud cheers. In ancient Rus, victories were celebrated with the ringing of bells. The copper voices of the temples carried the joyful news for many miles around. This tradition had its roots in ancient times, when each strike of the bell announced that the native land was once again free from enemies. But bell ringing was not the only way to celebrate. In medieval Europe, victors were greeted with trumpet blasts, drum beats, and torchlight processions. Each nation had its own distinctive ceremonial traditions, but they were united by one thing: the desire to make the moment of triumph unforgettable, to imprint it in the memory of generations. In Russia, church services of Thanksgiving held a special place. After every significant victory, prayers were held in churches, and bells rang not just a call to worship, but a special solemn peal. This peal had its own melody and rhythm, which distinguished it from the usual calls to worship or alarm signals. Interestingly, the first attempts to use gunpowder to celebrate victories appeared in Russia as early as the 14th century. After his victory at Kulikovo Field in 1389, Prince Dmitry Donskoy ordered amusing lights to be launched into the sky, the prototype of future fireworks. These were primitive pyrotechnic devices, but they already contained the seed of an idea that would turn into magnificent artillery salutes centuries later. However, the real development of the tradition of ceremonial salutes began much later, when a man ascended the Russian throne who radically changed not only the appearance of the country, but also the ways of celebrating its victories. That man was Peter the Great. Peter the Great was a reformist monarch who not only ruled the country, but completely rethought its traditions. The young Tsar, who had visited Europe and seen the celebrations there, understood the power of solemn ceremonies. He believed that his subjects should not only know about the victories of their army, but also feel them emotionally, experiencing them as a personal triumph. Accustom your subjects to glory and military exploits. These were the words the Tsar used to explain his desire to develop the art of fireworks in Russia. For Peter, this was not just entertainment, but state policy. Every bright flash in the sky was supposed to remind the people of the power of Russian weapons and the glory of Russian regiments. Under Peter, the first true masters of fireworks appeared in Russia. Pyrotechnicians who were brought in from Europe or trained locally. The Tsar took a personal interest in the technical details, studied the composition of gunpowder, and watched the testing of new types of fireworks. Special workshops were set up in his palaces where rockets and other pyrotechnic devices were manufactured. Peter's first fireworks amazed his contemporaries with their beauty and scale. They were organized to mark important state events, the conclusion of alliances, the birth of heirs, and church holidays. But the most significant occasion for these solemn, fiery spectacles was military victories. The Tsar understood that the people needed not only news of victories, but also the emotional experience associated with these events. Fireworks created just such an experience, instantaneous, bright, and memorable. People may not have known the details of the battle or understood its strategic significance, but the roar and light in the sky told them, "We have won!" And that was enough. This laid the foundation for a tradition that would evolve over the centuries into the famous victory salutes. Peter did not simply borrow European customs, he adapted them to Russian conditions, creating a unique form of state celebration. On December 21st, 1709, Moscow witnessed an event that forever changed the Russian tradition of celebrating victories. On this day, Russian troops led by Peter the Great himself, returning after a brilliant victory in the Battle of Poltava, solemnly entered the capital from the Serpukhovsky checkpoint. The Battle of Poltava, which took place on June 27, 1709, was a turning point in the Northern War. The Swedish army of King Charles XII, previously considered invincible, was completely defeated by Russian troops. This victory not only secured Russia's southern borders, but also effectively predetermined the outcome of the entire 20-year war with Sweden. Peter understood the historical significance of the victory. Poltava was not just a military success, it marked the birth of Russia as a great European power. The Tsar wanted the celebration of this event to match its scale and significance for the future of the country. When the victorious regiments approached the walls of Moscow, a powerful artillery volley suddenly thundered over the capital. It was the first artillery salute in Russian history, in honor of a military victory. The sound of the guns spread throughout Moscow, announcing to the inhabitants that Russian weapons had triumphed over the strongest enemy in Europe. The salute was a carefully planned ceremony. The cannons were placed in specially prepared positions that ensured maximum audibility of the salvos in all areas of the city. The number of shots, their sequence, the intervals between salvos, everything was thought out to the smallest detail. Contemporaries wrote that the sound of the Poltava salute could be heard many versts from Moscow. It was not just the roar of cannons, it was the voice of a new Russia declaring itself to the whole world. From that moment on, artillery salutes became an integral part of Russian ceremonial celebrations. After the triumph in Poltava, the tradition of artillery salutes became firmly established in Russian state practice. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, every significant military victory was marked by ceremonial salutes in the capital and other major cities of the empire. These salutes became a symbol of Russian military glory and an integral part of imperial ceremonies. The salutes in honor of victories in the Russian-Turkish wars were especially lavish. The capture of Ochakov in 1788, Alexander Suvorov's victories in Italy, triumphs in the Balkans. Each of these events was accompanied by grand artillery celebrations. The number of salutes depended on the scale of the victory. A certain number of shots were fired for the capture of a fortress, and another number for the defeat of an enemy army. Under Empress Catherine II, the practice of salutes was systematized. Strict rules were introduced, determining exactly how many salutes were to be fired for a particular victory, from which guns the salute was to be fired, at what time of day, and in what order. These rules were recorded in special artillery regulations and were strictly observed in all cities of the empire. The Napoleonic Wars became a time of particularly frequent victory salutes. The Battle of Borodino, the capture of Paris, the expulsion of the French from Russia. Each of these events was marked by solemn salutes. The salute in honor of the victory over Napoleon in 1814 was one of the most grandiose in the history of pre-revolutionary Russia. Interestingly, by the end of the 19th century, salutes had become so commonplace that their absence was perceived as a sign of the insignificance of an event. Military victories without artillery salutes seemed incomplete, underestimated by the state. This shows how deeply rooted in the Russian consciousness was the tradition established by Peter the Great. But the events of October 1917 drastically changed the fate of Russian victory salutes. The 1917 revolution swept away many traditions of old Russia, and victory salutes were no exception. The new government perceived them as remnants of the Tsarist regime, as symbols of imperialist militarism that had no place in a proletarian state. Artillery salutes in honor of military victories seemed to the Bolsheviks to be a manifestation of militaristic ideology, which should be abandoned. The early years of Soviet power were a time of rejection of everything associated with the former regime. The Red Army created its own traditions, fundamentally different from those of the Tsarist regime. Instead of ceremonial salutes, victories were celebrated with revolutionary demonstrations, rallies, and workers' parades. Artillery was used exclusively for combat operations, not for ceremonial purposes. The Civil War further reinforced this attitude. Guns were needed at the front, every shell counted, and spending them on salutes seemed an unaffordable luxury. Victories over the White Army were celebrated with political speeches, revolutionary songs, and red banners, but not with artillery salutes. Even when the Civil War ended, the tradition of salutes was not revived. The 1920s and 1930s were marked by the construction of a new society, which was to differ from the old one in everything, including the ways of celebrating victories. Soviet military successes, the suppression of anti-Soviet uprisings, victories in local conflicts, were celebrated in a completely different way. But history has its own logic. Traditions that respond to the deep needs of the national consciousness do not disappear without a trace. They may fade into the background for a time, but sooner or later, they find a way to revive in new forms. And when, in 1941, the Soviet Union faced the greatest test in its history, the old traditions proved to be in demand. The Great Patriotic War forced people to take a fresh look at many things that had previously seemed like relics of the past. Artillery salutes in honor of military victories were among them. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin had already been ruling the Soviet state for 20 years. During those years, he repeatedly demonstrated his ability to rethink ideological dogmas for the sake of the country's practical needs. When the war with Germany began, many traditions that had previously been considered bourgeois relics suddenly took on new life. Stalin understood the power of symbols and traditions like no one else. He saw how the Germans used propaganda tools and how important the emotional component of war was to the people. Victories on the front lines had to be not only reported in Soviet-form bureau bulletins, but also experienced by the entire Soviet society as personal triumphs of each individual. The first 2 years of the war were difficult for the Red Army. Defeat followed defeat. Territories were abandoned one after another, and millions of Soviet people were captured or killed. In these conditions, it was premature to talk about victory salutes. But Stalin was already thinking about the time when the situation would change. The turning point came at the end of 1942 at Stalingrad. For the first time in the entire war, the Red Army not only stopped the German offensive, but also launched a decisive counteroffensive. The encirclement of Paulus's Sixth Army showed that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that it could not only be stopped, but also defeated. It was at this time that Stalin first had the idea of reviving the tradition of victory salutes. Army General Sergei Shcherenko later recalled the words of the Supreme Commander. Even in ancient times, when troops won victories, all the bells rang in honor of the commanders and their troops. It would be good for us to celebrate victories in a more tangible way, and not just with congratulatory orders. These words show that Stalin consciously drew on historical tradition and the experience of previous generations. He understood that the people needed not only rational explanations of what was happening, but also emotional experiences that would unite society and maintain morale. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 was the largest battle of the Great Patriotic War and one of the decisive events of the entire Second World War. The German command concentrated enormous forces on a relatively small section of the front. More than 900,000 soldiers and officers, 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft. The operation was codenamed Citadel and was intended to turn the tide of the war in Germany's favor. Hitler and his generals hoped to surround and destroy large forces of the Red Army with one powerful blow, after which they would launch a general offensive and regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. German propaganda was already preparing reports of a new grandiose victory that would restore the German people's faith in ultimate victory. But the Soviet command was ready for the German offensive. Intelligence accurately determined the directions of the enemy's main strikes, the start time of the operation, and the composition of the German groups. The Red Army created a deeply echeloned defense, which was supposed to wear down the attackers and then go on the counteroffensive and crush the weakened enemy. The battle began on July 5, 1943, and lasted almost 7 weeks. The Germans threw new reserves into the battle, trying to break through the Soviet defenses, but without success. On July 12th, the largest tank battle in history took place near Prokhorovka, involving about 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns on both sides. By the end of July, it was clear that the German offensive had failed. Operation Citadel was halted. German troops went on the defensive, and the Red Army was able to launch its own offensive. The turning point in the war, which began at Stalingrad, was finally completed in the fields near Kursk. It was the victory in the Battle of Kursk that gave Stalin the reason to implement his long-cherished idea of reviving the tradition of victory salutes. But this idea was to be realized in connection with the liberation of 2 specific cities. The idea of the first victory salute was born in a specific historical situation, but its appearance was not accidental. By August 1943, Soviet troops had liberated Orel and Belgorod, 2 important cities captured by the Germans in the early months of the war. These were the first major administrative centers recaptured from the enemy during the summer campaign of 1943. Marshal of the Soviet Union, Andrei Ivanovich Yeremenko, left detailed memoirs about how the idea for the salute came about. In early August 1943, Stalin traveled to the Kalinin front in the frontline village of Koroshevo. In the morning, General Yeremenko reported to him on the situation and plans for upcoming offensive operations. In the middle of the report, one of Stalin's accompanying officers entered the hut and announced the joyful news: "Our troops have liberated Belgorod." Stalin listened to this message with obvious satisfaction. Then came the news of the liberation of Orel. These 2 victories, achieved in one day, made a special impression on the Supreme Commander. It was then, according to Yeremenko, that Stalin had the idea of celebrating these successes in a special way. He said, "You know what? It would be nice to mark this victory with a salute." In the old days, victories were marked by the ringing of bells, and we could salute with artillery salvos. These words became a turning point in the history of Soviet military traditions. Stalin understood the symbolic significance of the moment. The liberation of Orel and Belgorod was not just a tactical success, it was a demonstration that the Red Army had finally seized the strategic initiative and would now only advance. Such an event deserved special recognition, but it was a complicated journey from idea to implementation. Not only did a political decision have to be made, but many technical issues had to be resolved. Where to get the guns for the salute, how many salvos to fire, how to organize the entire event so that it would make the maximum impression on the people. The decision to hold the first victory salute required detailed preparation. Stalin entrusted the organization of the event to Pavel Artemyev, commander of the Moscow Military District, and Daniil Zhuravlev, commander of the Moscow Air Defense Front. These experienced military leaders had to resolve a number of technical issues on which the success of the entire undertaking depended. The first problem was that the Moscow garrison did not have enough blank shells. In wartime, every piece of ammunition was precious, and using them for ceremonial purposes seemed wasteful. However, after a thorough search, 1,200 blank shells were found, which was enough for the salute. The second issue concerned the number and placement of the guns. Experts conducted acoustic calculations and determined that in order for the salute to be heard throughout Moscow, at least 100 anti-aircraft guns would need to be used. The main salute platform was located in the Kremlin, but additional guns were scattered throughout the city for even sound coverage. Special attention was paid to the safety of the event. Blank shots still posed a certain danger to those around them, so the areas where the guns were located were carefully cordoned off. In addition, there was a possibility that German aircraft might attempt to disrupt the celebration, so Moscow's entire air defense system was put on high alert. The organizers also thought through the propaganda aspect of the event. The salute was not only to be heard, but also to be presented correctly to the Soviet people and the world community. Texts for print and radio were prepared in advance, and photographers and cameramen were selected to capture the historic event. The number of salvos was also calculated in advance. Given the available ammunition supplies and the number of guns, each installation could fire no more than 12 shots. It was decided to fire exactly that many salvos in honor of the liberation of Orel and Belgorod, 12 ceremonial shots at regular intervals. The 5th of August, 1943, went down in history as the day of the first victory salute of the Great Patriotic War. At exactly midnight Moscow time, the capital of the Soviet Union resounded with powerful artillery salvos, announcing to the whole world that the Red Army had won an important victory over the German fascist invaders. 12 salvos from 124 guns thundered over Moscow at 30-second intervals. The firing, the evening of August 5, 1943, Moscow time, marked a historic event. The first victory salute of the Great Patriotic War. It was an evening filled with anticipation and celebration, as the capital of the entire Soviet people prepared for a unique moment. The celebration of the liberation of two key cities, Orel and Belgorod, from Nazi troops. The solemn ceremony began at midnight sharp. At the appointed time, Moscow resounded with a mighty roar. 124 guns fired 12 volleys at intervals of 30 seconds. The echo of the volleys rolled through the streets, courtyards, and squares, reaching the very outskirts of the city. causing joy and tears among thousands of ordinary people. The salute was not just a technical operation. It turned into a citywide celebration. Muscovites of all ages took to the streets to experience this victory together. The townspeople, tired of the hardships of the war years, looked up at the sky with hope for the first time in a long time, smiled at each other, and hugged strangers. The salute became a symbol of change, proof that the war had entered a decisive stage, that faith in victory was becoming a reality. Ordinary Muscovites remembered this evening for the rest of their lives. Children clapped their hands joyfully, women cried with happiness, and men exchanged congratulations. Many wrote down their impressions in diaries and sent letters to the front to let the soldiers know that their labor and sacrifices had not gone unnoticed. The salute did not simply herald victory. It united and inspired people, making them part of a great story. The organizers provided not only sound, but also visual effects for the event. Simultaneously with the artillery salvos, rockets soared into the sky, illuminating Moscow at night with hundreds of fiery flashes. Firefighters, police, and medical workers were on high alert. Everything was thought out to the smallest detail to avoid dangerous consequences. The event was widely covered in the media. Newspapers, radio, newsreels, everything recorded the moments of celebration. Soviet reporters broadcast the voice of the people, telling how Muscovites were experiencing this historic night and how soldiers at the front, listening to the fireworks on the radio, felt part of the great victory. The first victory salute marked the beginning of a new tradition. From then on, every important victory on the front was celebrated with solemn artillery salutes, and May 9th, 1945, became the most grandiose triumph of this tradition. The reaction of the Soviet people and the world community to the first victory salute proved that the choice of how to celebrate triumphs was the right one. People who had lived in constant tension during the war perceived the salute as a sign of hope, a symbol of a return to the life that the war had taken away. People walked the streets of the capital until morning. Strangers congratulated each other, shared their joy, and exchanged the latest news from the front. The fireworks made a particular impression on children. For them, the salutes were not only a signal of the end of troubled days, but also the beginning of a new, brighter era. Family archives contain photographs, memories, and drawings in which the Moscow fireworks display occupies a central place. Many veterans later said, "That night, for the first time, we truly believed that victory would be ours." Joy and pride overwhelmed not only the residents of Moscow, but the entire country. Letters describing the fireworks spread across the front lines and the rear, and newspaper publications conveyed the atmosphere of celebration in detail. Soldiers and officers who were far from the capital felt part of the great event. Their relatives, colleagues, and neighbors wrote to them, "There were fireworks in Moscow." The world press reacted enthusiastically. Telegrams about the unusual celebration of the Soviet victory flew to newspaper offices in London, Washington, and Paris. Foreign correspondents noted that Moscow had found a way to let the world know that the struggle was continuing, and that the early victories were only the beginning of a long road. Victory salutes became a diplomatic signal to allies and enemies alike. The Soviet Union was ready for new military successes. From that time on, works of art, films, and literary magazines began to describe salutes more and more often. Their symbolism, their contribution to strengthening morale, and their significance for the national psyche. The ceremonial volley became an emblem of the courage and unity of the Soviet people. Thus began the path of salutes as an important part of national identity, a simple and powerful way to celebrate victories and inspire new achievements. This path continued in the subsequent years of the war, at all stages of the liberation of Soviet cities and countries in Eastern Europe. The salute system during the war years was carefully designed to reflect the military significance of the event, its scale, and its contribution to the overall victory. The Supreme Commander-in-Chief introduced a gradation of salutes by degrees, from the highest, intended for particularly significant victories, to the more modest, for the liberation of individual cities or the achievement of local successes. Traditionally, the highest salute consisted of 124 guns and 12 volleys. This was the case during the liberation of Orel and Belgorod. The second degree was assigned for successes on individual fronts. The number of guns was reduced to 50 or 30, and the number of volleys to 5. Where possible, the salute was carried out by district garrisons using local artillery. Military engineers detailed the technical regulations, what type of ammunition to use, where to place the guns, and the order of firing. Safety, effectiveness, and risk minimization were the basis of planning. Despite the martial law, everything was done with the utmost caution. Each salute was accompanied by an official order from the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, which was published in newspapers, read on the radio, and announced at rallies. This turned the congratulations into a special state ceremony with a clear protocol. Not only artillerymen were involved in the salutes, but also volunteers, police officers, medics, and security service workers. A direct association quickly formed in the public consciousness. If a salute sounds, it means there is a real victory, not just a propaganda message. People learned to distinguish real successes from attempts to pass off wishful thinking as reality, and salutes became a marker of genuine turning points. The salute system remained in place until the end of the war, and then became a permanent part of festive ceremonies, adapted to peacetime realities. Now, artillery salutes are perceived as a sign of respect for historical achievements, a living reminder of the past, and an incentive to preserve memory. Victory salutes became an integral part of life in the capital until the very end of the war. After the first solemn evening, each new significant success of the Red Army was accompanied by a rocket and artillery triumph. The liberation of Kiev, Minsk, Leningrad, and subsequent operations in Europe, each such event became a reason for a new salute, with a clear sequence and protocol. During the lulls between major operations, Muscovites waited for new salutes with particular excitement. These were moments of national unity, albeit brief, allowing people to feel a shared joy and hope. People tried to be together during these moments. Families, friends, even strangers gathered in the streets to hear the voice of victory together. During the war years, the tradition of salutes spread to other cities. Leningrad, which had survived the blockade, celebrated the liberation of the city with loud volleys as a symbol of life and freedom. In Kiev, Minsk, Riga, Vilnius, each liberation of the capital of a Union Republic was accompanied by its own salute, emphasizing the significance of the event for the entire nation. Sometimes, due to a lack of ammunition or technical capabilities, the salute was carried out symbolically. Rockets were exploded, fireworks were launched, and light shows were organized. The main thing was not to miss the moment of unity, to show people that their victories were celebrated by the state, that their labor and feats were valued. By the end of the war, salutes had become part of urban culture. People passed on information about the time of the salutes to each other, and gathered in advance in squares, parks, and at city landmarks. Some Muscovites even introduced their own family traditions, preparing a festive table, listening to the radio, and expressing words of gratitude to each other. Victory salutes became an important part of national memory. They bring a sense of belonging, respect for past generations, and a willingness to defend the homeland again if necessary. Their symbolism proved so great that it outlived the war itself and became part of modern culture. May 9th, 1945, became the day of the most grandiose fireworks display in the history of the Great Patriotic War. When, at 2:41 p.m. Moscow time, the act of unconditional surrender of Germany came into force, fireworks of such power, unprecedented in the history of mankind, thundered over the capital of the Soviet Union. 1,000 artillery pieces fired 30 solemn salvos. It was not just a salute. It was a symphony of victory, performed by cannons of all calibers. Field guns, howitzers, and mortars were added to the usual anti-aircraft installations. Each type of artillery contributed its own voice to the general chorus of triumph over fascism. Organizing this unprecedented event required a tremendous effort. Artillery units arrived in Moscow from all fronts that had already completed their combat missions by that time. Officers and soldiers, who had recently been defeating the enemy at the walls of the Reichstag, were now preparing for a peaceful but no less responsible task. The salute was accompanied by a grand fireworks display of multicolored rockets and the illumination of 160 anti-aircraft searchlights, whose beams crossed in the Moscow sky, creating a fantastic light show. For the first time during the war, Muscovites saw their capital fully lit up. Electric lights burned in all districts, emphasizing that the days of blackouts were now a thing of the past. The reaction of the people was unprecedented. Millions of people took to the streets, not only Muscovites, but also visitors from all over the country who had come to the capital specifically to share in the joy of victory. People cried, laughed, hugged strangers, and danced right on the sidewalks. Many held portraits of deceased relatives in their hands. The salute was dedicated not only to the living, but also to the memory of millions of fallen heroes. This salute became the final point in the history of military salutes and, at the same time, the beginning of a new tradition, the annual celebration of Victory Day. Since then, every May 9th, artillery salutes remind the whole world of the price the Soviet people paid for the liberation of humanity from fascism. The legacy of victory salutes has outlived the era in which they were born and has become an integral part of Russian state tradition. After the end of the Great Patriotic War, the salutes did not disappear, but were transformed into peaceful ceremonies while retaining their symbolic power and emotional impact on people. In the post-war decades, salutes became an obligatory element of major state holidays. May 9th, November 7th, February 23rd. Each of these dates is marked by solemn artillery salutes that connect modern Russia with its heroic past. Fireworks have become a symbol of generational continuity, a living reminder of the exploits of our ancestors. The technical side of salutes has also undergone significant changes. Modern salutes use specially designed blank charges that create more impressive sound and light effects. Computer control systems have appeared, allowing volleys to be synchronized with split-second precision, creating complex rhythmic compositions. The geography of salutes has expanded significantly. While during the war years they were heard mainly in Moscow, Now ceremonial salutes are produced in dozens of cities in Russia and the countries of the former Soviet Union. Each regional center has its own traditions for holding salutes, but they all date back to that first salute on August 5, 1943. International fireworks displays occupy a special place. Joint celebrations held in honor of memorable dates of World War II. Russia, Belarus, and the countries of Eastern Europe coordinate the fireworks displays, creating a single space of memory and recognition of the historical merits of the Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition. Salutes have also become an important part of diplomatic protocol. State visits by high-ranking guests, the signing of important international treaties, and anniversary dates in the history of friendly countries. All these events can be accompanied by solemn artillery salutes, emphasizing their historical significance. Today, the victory salute remains one of the most vivid and emotionally charged elements of Russian state symbolism, reminding everyone that freedom and independence are achieved not with words, but with deeds and the sacrifices of generations of patriots